Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be doing Unit 2, Introduction to Climate Change Adaptation. At the end of this lecture, students should be able to define climate change adaptation, discuss the progress of climate change adaptation worldwide, state what are small island developing states, outline the importance of adaptation in small island developing states, discuss the progress of SIDS in relation to adaptation, and list the importance of mainstreaming adaptation in SIDS, or what we call small island developing states. We're going to be talking about the benefits, the various enablers, limits, and barriers. What is climate change adaptation? According to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, adaptation refers to adjustments in ecological, social, or economic systems in response to real or anticipated climatic stimuli and their effects or impacts. It refers to changes in processes, practices, and structures to moderate potential damage or take advantage of opportunities associated with climate change. We could also say that adaptation with reference to climate change is the adjustment of existing systems to reduce climate risks and vulnerability. Now, when we talk about adaptation, it's very important to take into consideration that adaptation is very context specific. It's dependent on the path that the world is going, and it requires an integrated multi-sectoral approach. How has the world been doing? It's important to note that there is increasing public and political awareness of climate risk, and consequently, adaptation planning and implementation has been growing globally. Now, the IPCC 2022 reports suggest that over 170 countries include adaptation in their climate policies and planning processes. It is also realized that there has been various improvements too, and increasing development of tools to assist with adaptation decisions. When we talk about climate change adaptation, it is usually geared towards focusing on 4 general focus areas of adaptation globally. And these 4 areas are urban and rural infrastructure, cross-sectoral, energy, and land and ocean ecosystems. Now, an example of climate response and adaptation is shown on the screen. We have land and ocean ecosystems as a system, and there are various areas of land and ocean ecosystems that we can look at. We can look at coastal socio-ecological systems, we can look at terrestrial and ocean ecosystem services, water security, or food security. And as you can see on the screen, there are various adaptation options that one can employ to try and reduce some of the effects of climate change on these various systems. So for coastal socio-ecological system, we see that coastal defense and hardening using seawalls and levees and breakwalls is something that can be employed. For terrestrial and ocean ecosystem services, we realize that you can use a forest-based adaptation approach. For water security, you can use water use efficiency approach, and for food security, improved cropland management. Let's look at small island developing states, more commonly referred to as SIDS. What are they? Now, small island developing states are a distinct group of 39 states and 18 associate members of United Nations regional commissions that face unique social, economic, and environmental vulnerabilities. As you can see on the screen, these different countries or islands are usually concentrated in the areas of the Pacific, the Caribbean, and the AIMS. Now, the AIMS stands for countries within the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, and the South China Seas. By virtue of their location, SIDS have a long history of exposure to hydrometeorological hazards, as well as non-climate events, such as landslides, earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, or what we call geophysical hazards. In summary, SIDS are not vulnerable because of a single characteristic, but it is their exposure to a combination of foregoing stressors, both climate and non-climate factors, that define and characterize their unique vulnerability. Furthermore, there is considerable evidence from the published literature which demonstrates that on account of their relatively low level of resources, SIDS are a group of countries with a low adaptive capacity to climate change. It is this combination of limited resources, whether financial or technical skills, or easy access to available and appropriate adaptation technologies, that limits the capacity of small island developing states to enhance their resilience and reduce their vulnerability. Enhanced vulnerability will threaten the capacity of SIDS to achieve their short, medium, and long-term economic and social development goals. Why is adaptation important to small island developing states? Climate-related ocean changes and changes to extreme events are projected to amplify climate risks and damage to small islands. These include increased loss of human life, loss and damage during extreme events, and dramatic decrease in habitable areas. Some small island communities may reach or exceed their adaptation limits before greenhouse gas emissions can be reduced to acceptable levels. And if you ask that question again, so what have small islands been doing? Small islands have been trying to do a lot. They have tried to use different approaches to try to reduce some of the effects of climate change. And so you realize they have implemented hard protections, such as breakwaters and sea walls to protect their coastlines. They have employed different accommodation approaches, such as the reclaiming of land and the elevation of homes. They have also migrated to different areas, whether they have voluntarily migrated or they were forced because of a drought or flooding in that particular area of their island. They would be forced to move to another part of the island. Some persons voluntarily migrate. You are also seeing where some small islands are trying to employ this approach of coral reef restoration and the restoration of mangroves. And we know that these different ecosystems play a pivotal role in protecting our coastlines from storms and erosion. And coral reefs also help in bulking up the food supply by providing a diverse or a wide range of aquatic life and fish. Why is adaptation important for small islands? These are the different approaches, other from the one referred before, that small islands are trying to incorporate in order to reduce the effects. You have community-based adaptation, we have livelihood responses, we have disaster risk management, we have community-based adaptation where persons in various communities in small islands are trying to work on different local projects on a community scale to balance the different dynamics within their communities and try to better adapt to climate change and their effects. We have livelihood responses. So there is a diversification of livelihoods from persons in various sectors such as farming, where they're using improved irrigation technologies or water harvesting methods. We also see where persons in the fisheries industry, because fisheries is also a major sector in small island developing states. And we're seeing where persons in these sectors are also trying to find more creative and sustainable ways in fishing. We have disaster risk management, where small islands are trying to be more strategic in their approach in how information is disseminated and how you approach detecting and analyzing and using various forecasting mechanisms. Progress of SIDS in relation to adaptation. Despite the challenges, there is noticeable progress in climate adaptation among SIDS. One way to examine the progress is to look at the adaptation actions of SIDS in their national communications to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, Robbins in 2015 assesses 977 adaptation actions across 16 SIDS in the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, and South China Sea, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. Now, based on these assessments, 5 broad adaptation typologies or actions or approaches, as some persons would call them, were identified. These actions are observation and assessments, planning, institutions and policies, implementation and management, monitoring and evaluation, education, and training. Adaptation actions that were mentioned earlier can be further divided into actions related to climate vulnerabilities and non-climate vulnerabilities. As you can see on the screen, majority of the actions geared toward reducing the effects of climate vulnerabilities are actions that are geared towards reducing hydrometeorological hazards, such as tropical cyclones and storms, storm surges, floods, droughts. For non-climate vulnerabilities, those actions are geared towards reducing economic poverty and other social issues. If we look even further on adaptation actions by actors and sector, it is realized that national governments are the major actors in developing adaptation actions to try to reduce the effects of climate change. And when we look at adaptations by sector, we realize that there is an even spread of the different sectors in coming up with various adaptation actions. If you realize on the screen, you have coastal zone, agriculture and forestry, water, environment and natural resources, ecosystem and biodiversity. So there's an even spread. The most common climate change activities are vulnerability and impact assessments. National governments undertook most of the actions as sole actors, and coastal zones, agriculture and forestry and water account for most sector-specified actions. So based on the data that we're seeing, those are some of the conclusions that we can make. Now, what is the importance of mainstreaming adaptation in small island developing states? Mainstreaming adaptation refers to the integration of climate change adaptation measures into the planning, policies, and operational frameworks of various sectors and governance levels. It's about embedding climate resilience into the very fabric of socioeconomic development. For SIDS, this approach is crucial due to their high vulnerability to climate impacts and the interconnected nature of their social, economic, and environmental systems. When we talk about mainstreaming adaptation in SIDS, we talk about using various successful mainstreaming adaptation approaches, such as policy integration, community engagement, capacity building and education, financial mechanisms, and monitoring and evaluation. When you talk about mainstreaming adaptation, it is important to also mention some of the benefits of mainstreaming adaptation. When we look at the benefits, we look at various benefits such as comprehensive resilience building. Mainstreaming adaptation ensures that climate resilience is not an afterthought, but a foundational aspect of development planning. We look at enhanced policy coherence. Mainstreaming fosters policy coherence across different sectors, ensuring that climate adaptation goals are aligned with broader development objectives. We also look at cost effectiveness, which speaks about integrating adaptation into ongoing policies and projects to make it more cost effective rather than implementing separate adaptation initiatives. Let's look at some of the enablers, limits, and barriers to adaptation in cities. It's important to note that when you speak about enablers, we're referring to factors or conditions that facilitate or support the implementation of adaptation strategies in cities. They contribute positively to the adaptation process, making it more effective and sustainable. Some enablers of adaptation in cities include local community involvement, technological innovations, policy frameworks and governance, international support and funding. When we look at the various limits and barriers, it is important to note that limits are what we call factors that inherently constrain the scope, effectiveness, or extent of adaptation strategies. And they're oftentimes unalterable, or they require significant effort and resources to change. While barriers, on the other hand, are obstacles that hinder the process of implementing various adaptation strategies. Unlike limits, barriers can be potentially overcome once various targeted actions are used. We see various limits and barriers to adaptation on the screen: physical and geographic limitations, economic constraints, social and cultural challenges, institutional and capacity constraints. One that I want to focus on is physical and geographic limitations. Small island developing states, by virtue of their size, they are physically small. And so, because they're physically small, their economies are also small. So they are not able to compete with various economies of scale on the global market. And so that leaves them vulnerable to various economic shocks. These economic shocks put them in various positions where they're not in a financial position to oftentimes fund various sustainable initiatives that are geared towards reducing the effects of climate change, or they're not in a position where they're able to implement various adaptations that are required to help alleviate some of the effects. We can look at an example of enablers, limits, and barriers to adaptation in cities. And we can use coral reef restoration as an ecosystem-based adaptation approach. And specifically, we can look at different risks in which this ecosystem-based approach is used to remedy certain risks such as coastal erosion, loss of biodiversity, coastal flooding. There are certain barriers, however, such as competing land uses from tourism. And of course, there are limits, such as biophysical limitations relating to ocean acidification, ocean temperature, sea level rising. To conclude, it is important to note that there are many limitations to adaptation, and in a lot of discourse on adaptation limits, there are numerous thresholds on which traditional adaptation responses might become ineffective. That is where you would enter the realm of loss and damage. I want to thank you for listening. That's the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, you can email them to me at daneoredler@gmail.com. Our next stop on this wonderful journey is Unit 5, the importance of blue and green economy. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. See you then.